Hello everyone, welcome back to the FPL Vincenzo YouTube channel, also available on audio. And the latest pod here is going to be looking at sort of the three promoted teams from the Championship last year. I think it's become sort of a common sort of thought process now that for the last two seasons, the three promoted sides from the Championship have gone straight back down. Sheffield United, Luton and Burnley in the 22-23 season came up and then went straight back down. Then obviously Southampton, Ipswich and Leicester last season had been promoted and went straight back down. So what does that mean for Leeds, Burnley and Sunderland now? The common sort of thought and the general sort of lazy approach, shall we say, would be that the three would struggle again. But now we come into an FPL season where quite a lot's going on. We've got Brentford who have lost their manager, sort of taking a risk on someone largely unknown. You've got Bournemouth losing a lot of their defenders. Some other teams, maybe West Ham, not really improving their squad. Teams like Wolves will constantly be expected to be there or thereabouts. So I don't think it's a guarantee that the three promoted teams will go straight back down, but I can see why that sort of mindset is adopted. So I thought we'd do a little bit of a pod here looking at how they did last year, those three teams in their Championship seasons. Compare that to what's happened sort of the last 4 or 5 years. Talk about sort of expectations, talk about what they can do to improve their fate, shall we say. And then we can sort of have a thought at the end on how we think they'll do. So jumping straight into it, this is on the screen right now is sort of how they did last year. So you'll see it's fairly promising and nothing overly groundbreaking here. You've got Leeds, obviously came up as champions. Burnley came up finishing second. Sunderland came up via the playoffs, having finished fourth. You'll see goals conceded. Leeds and Burnley were the top two. And we're also the top two in terms of expected goals conceded, XGC, albeit flipped. So Burnley actually conceded the fewest goals, but it was Leeds that had the best XGC. Maybe some sort of opinion there on how important James Trafford was for Burnley. And certainly I thought I've heard Andy Martin, Leeds fan, say it before, I think on on Twitter. And I think FPL Rhinos has said it on Planet FPL when he appeared on there, that Meslier and Trafford, if you swap those two around last year, the two goalkeepers, how different would those two teams have performed? So I think Meslier takes a lot of the blame for Leeds having an XGC and goals conceded basically in line, where Burnley were expected to concede 39 goals and actually only conceded 16. So that was the height of their sort of overperformance in terms of what the data suggested versus what they actually delivered. For Sunderland, they conceded 44. The expected goals conceded was 49. So their goals conceded was the fourth best in the league. Their expected was the fifth best. That's relatively noteworthy because most of the teams that have come up in recent years haven't been fifth for expected goals conceded. They've been top three or worst case top four. So I've just put in the key points notes here. Nottingham Forest in the 21-22 season, when they came up, were the last promoted team to have an XGC higher than Sunderland. So Sunderland, they expected, was 49. Just for coincidence sake, that was exactly the same as Southampton last season, or Southampton in the 23-24 Championship season. Their expected was 49. Sunderland matched that. No one's been higher though since Forest, where their expected was 54. In the 21-22 Championship season. Obviously didn't hurt them because they stayed up when they came back to the Prem, albeit under Steve Cooper. And then Forest also appear in the stats again because a repeat of that 21-22 season. They were the last promoted team not to be in the top four for XGC. So Forest in that season were sixth with their XGC of 54. Everyone since has been top four. Even Southampton had the fourth best XGC with their 49. Compared to Sunderland, the fifth best. So it's clear Leeds and Burnley doing as well as you would expect and as well as most promoted teams in recent years. Sunderland, not so much, matching Southampton in terms of underlying data, but the fact they're not in the top three and not even in the top four for XGC rank is maybe a little bit concerning. So some food for thought there in terms of Sunderland defensively. If we do then a comparison of Sunderland versus Southampton and Ipswich last season, because again, those two teams are fairly big anomalies if you look at the last 5 seasons as a whole in terms of Championship teams promoted. Ipswich and Southampton stood out for quite a few sort of quite poor defensive metrics. So even though Ipswich finished second in the 23-24 season, they conceded 57 goals, which was the 7th worst in the league. Sunderland conceded 63 to come up through the playoffs, and that was the 14th worst in the league. In terms of goals conceded, most teams, again, have been sort of top 4 at the end of season for the Championship and got promoted with that. Say Ipswich and Sunderland were 7th and 14th respectively. Maybe something which we should have taken more note of heading into the season just gone, albeit, I say we probably did attack that in game week 1 last year. Newcastle had Southampton. Lots of us had multiple Newcastle players, only 1 goal. Not helped, obviously, by Newcastle getting a red card in that game. And then Liverpool did very well against Ipswich. And a lot of people captain Mo Salah, but not everybody. But I think most people probably captain Isak or Salah and took on one of these two so-called weak defences. What's interesting, though, is to say Sunderland only conceded 44, which is a lot less than Ipswich's 57 and Southampton 63. But in terms of expected goals conceded, Sunderland are basically on par with Ipswich and Southampton, as I've mentioned in the previous slide. Southampton and Sunderland both with 49. Ipswich are actually a little bit better in their promotion season, XGC of 46.7. So underlying data was similar. Rank in the league, Sunderland are actually the worst of the 3. But goals conceded, Sunderland stayed more in line with their expectation, whereas Ipswich and Southampton conceded a lot more than were expected. What's also noteworthy is in those particular examples of Ipswich and Southampton, they were the only 2 teams in the last 5 seasons of promoted Championship teams where their goals conceded were more than 2 worse than expected. I'd say Ipswich's case conceded 57 when the expected was 47. Southampton's case conceded 63 when the expectation was 49. So those 2 are wildly above what the expected was. Sunderland were actually better than they expected. So maybe a decent goalkeeper, some decent defensive performances, poor finishing against them. My takeaway from this is that I think Sunderland probably should be compared to Southampton and Ipswich. So if you thought those 2 teams were targetable in the Prem last year, I think your mindset should be that Sunderland, the initial expectation should be they're likely to be in a similar ballpark to Southampton and Ipswich looking at this, because the expected is so similar. We kind of know in the Prem that reliability of the finishing will be higher. Sunderland probably won't get away with as much as what they did in the Championship. I'll jump on again to do a direct comparison of Sunderland to Southampton, more so Southampton's progression or regression when they move from the Championship into the Premier League. So we know in their Championship season, they were 4th and they conceded 63 goals. Their jump to the Prem was that they finished bottom, obviously, and they conceded 86 goals. So that's an increase of 23 goals conceded between the Championship and the Prem. Not overly bad, to be honest. I mean, probably in line with expectation, particularly in the case of Leeds and Burnley. If they concede 23 more goals in their Championship season, that would give them a very good chance of staying up. Say maybe not so much Sunderland, but we can talk about that. Sunderland conceded 44. So following the Southampton model, they would concede 67. That might be enough to stay up. So obviously still quite a high number of goals conceded, around about 2 per game. Goals conceded rank, they dropped from 14th to 20th. XGC was an increase of 36. So again, it went from 49 to 85. It's not overly bad. They expected went from 49 to 85 plus 36. The actual conceded was 63 to 86 plus 23. So actually, the defence arguably improved. That the XGC increased at a higher rate than the actual goals conceded. What's worth pointing out with Southampton especially is that tactically, I think they approached the Premier League season badly. They obviously had a manager in Russell Martin who wanted to play quite a proactive style, quite a modern style. I think he's quite interesting now. He's ended up at Rangers, where that style is like where he's got better players compared to most teams in the league. That style could be very good. Company suffered a bit from this as well at Burnley, that he had a way he wanted to play, an ideology, shall we say. But it was quite unrealistic with what Southampton had. A couple of examples here that he tried to play out from the back. That might have worked in the Championship, but the pressing structure in the Premier League of better opponents is far higher. So the technical level of defenders to play through that press needs to be a lot higher. I'm not really convinced that defenders like Bednarek, maybe Jack Stevens, have the high enough ability with the ball to play through higher presses. But Martin was quite keen to do that anyway. If Southampton under Martin did want to play a bit more direct, a bit longer to avoid playing out from the back and potentially playing themselves into trouble. I think you remember the game against Newcastle on the opening day. They lost 1-0 trying to play out from the back, lost the ball, and Newcastle scored in that fashion. But if a lot of teams should avoid that now, to not play out through the back and just get the ball forward quickly, have a more direct target man to aim at who can win flick-ons, win headers, bring the ball down, help his team get up the pitch. I don't really think Southampton started last season with that. I know they brought on Uachu at midway point through the season when they started with Cameron Archer up front, probably one of the smallest strikers in the league. So they tried to play out from the back with inferior players. They didn't have a target man. And I wouldn't say, even if they did get through the press, if you look at what Southampton could have had in transition, the best teams in transition have quick players because obviously they can gallop through the space a lot quicker. Maybe take advantage of overloads much quicker. I wouldn't say Southampton's attack with whoever it was, Aribo, Dibbling, these sorts of players was especially pacey. So there's three quite big flaws here in how Russell Martin wanted to play the season. He had defenders or inferior defenders trying to play out from the back, getting themselves in trouble. No target man to play longer ball towards who's going to hold the ball up, get Southampton up the pitch more. And then a lack of transitional players up the pitch with speed to help in that regard. It was a recipe for disaster, really, from the off. I can't say I understand or know the Sunderland players well enough. I've not seen a lot of them. I saw a couple of their playoff games and things like that. So it'd be unfair for me right now to have an opinion on Sunderland's play style. Maybe it's something I can do. I know I get on well with FPL Beery, Spencer, who's the Planet FPL Sunderland correspondent. It's possible I could have him onto the channel before the season starts to talk about this in a bit more detail, whether Sunderland will follow this model. Will they try and play out from the back? Do they have a good enough target man that would allow them to play more directly? Do they have pace on transition and things like that? So I can't comment on whether Sunderland will follow this sort of poor Southampton model, but I say Sunderland, this is maybe a reason why Southampton's numbers ended up the way they did, because of these sorts of errors and issues. If I then jump on again to sort of some bigger averages now across sort of the last 5 seasons. So the last 15 teams to get promoted from the Championship to the Premier League, once they've in their Championship seasons where they've got promoted, they've conceded a total of 632 goals. In the Premier League seasons that have followed, that number's increased to 1,107. So it's an increase of 475 goals, which is an average of 32 each. If you look at the last 2 seasons, which is obviously a smaller sample, but I say it's noteworthy because of what's happened, particularly in the last 2 years. If you look at the last 5 seasons combined, you've had teams like Fulham that have stayed up. You've had like Leeds in their first season under Bielsa went from promotion to finish 9th. Brentford under Frank, when they first came up, finished 13th. Say Fulham had a season where they finished 10th directly after promotion. Teams like Bournemouth have come up and stayed up. There's been quite a few examples of teams that have done fairly well in their first promotion season. But the last 2 years, I say we've had Sheffield United, Luton, Burnley come up and go straight back down. And then last year, Southampton, Ipswich, Leicester. So the last 2 years are noteworthy for the small sample, but I think the standard of the Premier League has improved. Maybe it's become more difficult for these Championship teams to stay up. So I thought I'd do an analysis of these last 2 seasons as a combination to see if the numbers had changed, what the averages would do. And again, these 6 teams, they conceded 274 in the Championship, 515 in the Premier League. That's an increase of 241. The average from the last 5 years of 32 increase of goals conceded has now gone to 40. So if you look at the last 5 seasons, what does that mean for Sunderland? Their goals conceded jumps to 76. Based on the last 2 seasons, that jumps to 84. I say Southampton conceded 86. So it does push me more into the feeling that Sunderland came up with the worst defence of the 3 promoted teams. I think realistically, it's unusual for a team to finish 20th. Come up via the playoffs and then suddenly improve to the level where they're better than the others. It did happen to Nottingham Forest, so it's not impossible. 22, 23, but all three teams stayed up that year. So Forest still did the worst of those three teams. Bournemouth and Fulham that came up with Forest in 22, 23 did do better than Forest, albeit Forest did stay up. But in most years, it's the team that came up through the playoffs that find the adaptation to the Premier League the hardest. So I do think Sunderland will concede the most goals of the three promoted teams. Maybe you could make valid arguments that maybe they're more attractive to sign for than a Burnley. So maybe there's a possibility that Sunderland could strengthen more than Burnley managed to strengthen. We know from the example of Forest how mad they went in the transfer window, bought 15, 20 players. Sunderland probably have the capability and the appeal that they could do something similar. So it's not impossible we get a sort of a Forest repeat from Sunderland. But my sort of thought process is that they probably will concede sort of over 80 goals in the same way Southampton did, which would obviously make them a team to target. That's an average of conceding over 2 per game. And if they concede that, they're obviously a team to target. Just in a slide now on sort of a Sunderland survival guide, looking at a couple of examples of teams that have stayed up, what they did. So Forest and Brentford are probably the two teams I've looked to focus on. I say Forest in isolation, they went mad in the transfer market, got good players in like Morgan Gibbs, White, players like that, players that were probably a standard above a promoted team. So, albeit they didn't have the best tactics when they came up, particularly under Steve Cooper initially, obviously they changed manager, but they did have top players. Now, from what I know about Sunderland, you wouldn't look at their squad and think that's a squad of top players capable of mixing it in the Premier League. They've not gone out and bought. I think they will need to buy 6 or 7 players that are of a better Premier League standard, because I think you need either top players or top tactics to stay up as a minimum. Brentford stayed up without this. They had good players with Ivan Toney and Waymo, players like that, but it was more the tactics of Brentford that made them stay up. They were probably quite, I don't know what the word is really to describe. They were quite realistic, is probably the best way to put it, Brentford. Most teams, I say Southampton and Burnley, have come up playing a style that's worked for them in the Championship, where maybe in terms of player quality, they were among the best in the league. And I say the tactical standard in general of the Championship is a lot lower than in the Premier League. Brentford didn't try and overly play out from the back to play themselves into trouble. And they were quite physical and direct. If you look at ways to play that sort of is described as a leveller for an inferior team, don't try and match better teams at their own game with sort of intricate passing patterns and trying to have 60, 70% possession. That's not going to happen against most Premier League teams. Clear the ball quickly from dangerous areas, get it up the pitch, have a striker, say in Brentford's case, Toney, that can compete, hold the ball up, battle. Have a midfield, say Brentford had Norgard and players like that can compete and be physical. Don't make it easy for the opponent, sort of press them well, these sorts of things. And that's a leveller. And I think in Brentford's case as well, they've been quite open to playing back threes. And I think that's quite an important thing. As far as I'm aware, Leeds, Burnley, Sunderland don't play back threes. And I'm not sure they have the desire to. But if you look at the better inferior teams in the Prem in the last couple of years, you look at Crystal Palace won an FA Cup playing a back three. Wolves, I think, have been fairly steady for a number of years now playing a back three, and probably improved playing a back three under Vitor Pereira in the most recent part of last year. I think what back threes give you is the chance to compete. You've got plenty of bodies behind the ball in the defensive line, so you're harder to break down. Players are it's not complicated for the players to know what their roles are. Everyone's role within the team is quite rigid. So you're not asking people to be fluid and dynamic and think during the game. Like the better teams have those sorts of skill sets when they have the ball. It's like a game of chess in some ways. Say these largely inferior players is probably a nice way to put it. Don't make it complicated for them. Give them clear, defined roles, clear, defined guidelines, and they can perform that and operate that to a good level. And I think quite importantly, the players tend to be quite close together and quite compact. If you look at Sheffield United, I know when they came up, their regression was notable. They conceded 104 goals in the Prem. One, they wasn't helped by not having a competitive squad. They sold their 2 best players when they came up, and Ilian Ndiaye went to France, and Sander Berge left as well. That was a big loss. They lost their competitive Norgard type midfielder who was going to compete and battle and be physical in midfield. They lost their probably best attacking outlet. They did try and replace them, but they didn't very well. That was a recipe for disaster in isolation. And then their back 3 system was quite dynamic. They had outside centre-backs sort of appearing on the edge of the opponent's box. The gap between the outside centre-backs and the wing-backs was very big. So the passing distances between players was very long. Obviously more likely that something goes wrong in that process when players are asked to play longer distance passes. They may be misdirected, maybe they get intercepted, things like this. To keep things at a most basic level for inferior teams, if you compact the middle of the pitch, get plenty of people behind the ball, if you've got an outlet up front that you can play direct to, sort of reduce mistakes around your own goal, an outlet that can sort of win some free kicks, get you up the pitch. Be interesting if one of them signed someone like Dominic Calvert-Lewin, for example. I know he's been released by Everton. I know he's got issues around staying fit, but any of these 3 promoted teams, having him up front to compete and battle with sort of good defenders, I think he's capable of mixing it in that way. We know Forest have done well with Chris Wood, big component, and even Awoniyi when they first came up was quite a useful outlet for them. So get an outlet up front, get some speed in the team that offer you something in transition. But more importantly, I say keep things simple. Don't overcomplicate tactics. Keep things quite rigid. It's quite close together, so there's less likely to be errors, misplaced passes. If the ball's turned over, the player, there's not a lot of transitional space for the opposing team to move into. It'd be interesting if one of the, if it was me personally, I'd be looking to play a back 3 this year. We know from, I say, Brentford in the past have played back 3 in certain games. Wolves have done well playing back 3s. Palace have just won an FA Cup playing a back 3. So I think it can work for them. In terms of Sunderland expectations, I say my thought is right now they're likely to concede 80 plus goals, and I think 90 is realistic. The Premier League's only going to get harder, and the gap, but I think between the teams that have got sort of exposure to the Premier League and have been in it a couple of years, the gap between them and the promoted teams, I think, is only going to grow. So I think, yeah, I'm probably expecting Sunderland to score up near 90 goals. Then you ask yourself, how pragmatic is manager Regis Labrie going to be? Is he going to play a back 3? Is he going to try and play more like a Brentford system, try and keep things tight and compact? Or is he going to expect his fullbacks to get forward on the overlap and not be able to get back? Is he going to play expansively in midfield and try and outpass opponents? Is he going to go into the season without sort of an attacker that can compete with elite defences? I say it was a worry, I think, last year. I had a brief look at how Sunderland did. I think their top scorer was 10, 12 goals or something like that. That's not great, because I think Liam Delap's a really good striker. I think after Harry Kane, there's a good chance he'll be in the England squad for the next World Cup. I think in 3-4 years' time, he'll probably be leading the line for England. In isolation, he couldn't keep Ipswich up. So I think he's likely better, Delap, and what his skill set and traits were is likely to be better than whatever striker Sunderland end up with this year. And can Sunderland find someone that's anywhere near on Delap's level? Tough. Delap couldn't keep Ipswich up. So it's unlikely, I think, Sunderland find a striker that's going to have the impact Tony had or someone like that to keep them up. So that's not good. But someone that at least can give them a foothold in the game and give them some presence in the opponent's box or something would be a start. And I say we've spoken about Sheffield United when they came up, lost their best players. Not a great start for Sunderland to lose Joby Bellingham, who by all accounts was probably one of their better players in the Championship. They have, by all accounts now, I think it's been completed and gone through, signed Habib Diarra from Strasbourg. Again, don't know a lot about him. I think he is more an attacking central midfielder, more involved in playmaking and creativity more than tackling and things like that. Maybe a good sign that, again, I don't know if he's as good as Bellingham, but at least they've been aware that that position needs replacing quickly and not going into the season without anyone. They've been linked with plenty of other players as well. So I don't think we're going to get a Sheffield United type capitulation here from Sunderland, where they're going into this season with a weaker team than what they came up with. But worrying signs, I think they probably need a couple of dominant defenders. I know Leeds, for example, just signed 2 sort of over 6 foot centre backs. Again, I think they've had trouble in the past defending set pieces, but
2 penalty box defenders, give them capabilities like Milenkovic and Murillo at Forest to defend the box well, make it difficult to break them down. Can Sunderland find some centre-backs offering those skill sets, front foot, aggressive, defend the penalty box well, can sit in a deep block well? That'll be a challenge for them. Can they find an attacker that offers them some transitional threat? Maybe someone like Tony offered to Brentford, Delap offered to Ipswich, they'll need that. And maybe some pace out wide, I think, on the transition. But based on what I see right now, and based on what the data is suggesting from sort of particularly the last 5 years and more notably the last 2 years, we're looking at a Sunderland team that's probably realistically going to concede upwards of 80 goals, 90 goals, and you have to go into game week 1 thinking they're the team to target. So I think for me personally, it's quite hard, even though we haven't seen prices yet, it's quite hard for me to go into it thinking I don't want Jared Bowen. Whether I'll be brave enough to captain him is a different story. We'll see sort of nearer the time in game week 1. Because there are other players, particularly Salah and Haaland. If you're going one of those, I think both are captainable in game week 1. But I think Bowen's an option, and based on what we know at the moment, I think you target Sunderland until evidence and eye test suggests that that's not the right plan. That's it for now. I didn't want to go into too much depth, but just having a look at how Sunderland rank compared to other promoted teams in the last 5 years, in the last 2 years, you can sort of do some takeaways in your own sort of maths and analytics here around what that means for Leeds and Brentford as well. Not Brentford, sorry, Leeds and Burnley as well in terms of their promotion to the Premier League. So, yeah, thanks for listening, everyone. I'm going to do some pods sort of in the next week or so looking at wild cards because I've already done some pods looking at Mo Salah, and that's a critical decision for game week 1. I think the other critical decision is having a very sort of not permanent plan, but a good plan around when you want to wildcard, because that impacts sort of decisions you make in game week 1. So having a clear idea on when you're most likely to use it is a good start. So that'll be sort of the next block of pods for me, looking at different weeks to wildcard and the pros and cons of each of those. So they'll be up on the channel probably starting sort of later this week, moving into next week. Until then, thanks for listening and speak again soon.